So I'm going to reset.
This meeting is being recorded.
Go. Okay, our speaker today is Usha Reifsnider. Is a British Gujarati Christ follower from a. She and her husband Matt served in foreign missions since 1988. Their ministry emphasis has been on migrants, refugees, and diaspora. Usha holds the qualification of MTH from the University of Chester, whose academic focus is within the intersection of cultural anthropology and practical theology. She completed her PhD at OCMS in 2022 with her thesis titled Reclaiming British Gujarati Hindu Culture and Conversion to Evangelical Christianity. Usha serves as one of two regional directors of Lausanne Europe and as a director of the Center for Missionaries from the majority. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Usha.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks, Jan. Jan, I appreciate you being here. Jan is from the European Evangelical Alliances. He's a general secretary, and his partner in crime, Connie, will be presenting next week, hopefully. And I'm also very glad to see my examiner from my Viva, Dave Burnett, here with us as well, and some former students as well. So it's great. I'm so glad that you're all here. I appreciate you being. Oh, Roberto as well.
Roberto is joining. Yeah.
I feel like I'm surrounded by that great cloud of witnesses.
Oh, we got Al.
Great. So wonderful.
Tell me when you want me to share the.
So yes, you can start with the PowerPoint now. Right. Great. I don't know how many of you were here for the previous lecture that I gave on muted group theory, but whether you were or not, it's not essential that you have an understanding of the previous lecture, because I will give a little outline. But just to say that I began this series of lectures on muted group theory back in September of last year. And there were 4 lectures, and then there are supposed to be 4 lectures in this second series, and there will eventually be another 4 lectures. I don't know whether they'll be hosted at OCMS or elsewhere. But at the end of my thesis, I began to get more and more interested in muted group theory. And so really, this series of lectures and the book that will come out of this series of lectures is where my thesis ended and my research has continued. But just to quickly go over to recap muted group theory. So muting or silencing is a social behavior based on the implicit understanding that in a society there are dominant and non-dominant or subordinate groups. The dominant group is not necessarily the majority group. Mutedness refers to the inability to adequately express ideas verbally or otherwise in ways that are meaningful to the subordinate. So this theory was originally created or developed by Edwin and Shirley Ardner, and they used the theory back in the 70s to discuss feminism. But also, one thing that Edwin Ardner noted was that there was an aspect of being a man that had particular attributes. So if you were a man, you were sporty, you were strong, there were certain stereotypes that went along with it. So that sort of enables us to look at muted group theory, not just as a theory, but how it plays out in practice. Go to the next slide, please, Tom. So Edwin Ardner passed away, I think, sometime in the 80s or 90s, but his wife, Shirley Ardner, still lives around the corner from OCMS. She's in her late 90s. And I met her while giving a lecture at Lady Margaret Hall on international gender. And she was very interested in, surprisingly, in evangelical Christianity. And we didn't really discuss muted group theory, but that her interest sparked my interest in muted group theory a little bit more. Anyway, to just look at the theory as it develops. So Crameray looked at, in 1981, looked at muted group theory in terms of articulation of women by men. I liken it to this. If you can imagine a boardroom of executives, all men, let's say at a financial institution, and they say things like, well, I understand women because I'm married to one. Or another one says, I understand women because I have a sister. Or, well, I've got 4 daughters, so I understand women. But right outside of this discussion group, this boardroom, is a woman, and she's out there serving tea and typing and doing admin duties. And no one thinks to invite her opinion on women. Instead, men decide how a woman thinks. So, of course, these are sort of old-fashioned ideas now. But also, Mark Orb gave it a sort of a different look, a different perspective. And he uses the term standpoint theory. So depending on where you're standing, you can articulate and define a particular perspective. This is something that was done by Stuart Hall also in the late 90s when he talked about culture and cultural representation. Who is speaking for whom? What position do they hold in connection to the person who they are hoping to represent? So Mears and a whole group of others in 2005 looked at muted groups and individuals within those groups in 3 different categories. That there are people who are muted, but they're engaged. For example, the women who are working in this financial institution, this scene that I've set up, they know that they're muted, but they carry on doing something in the financial institution because, number one, it's a job, and it's better to have some place in there rather than no place at all. And so they'll engage with the men, but they never actually express themselves. And then there are those that are angrily disengaged. So that might be the women who are, I'm not going to work for a financial institution like that because they're all men. I'm just as qualified as they are. So I'm going to start something by myself or not get involved because they're not going to listen to me. I would be the only woman in that boardroom. And then there's Weston Turner, who look at different worldviews and the perpetuation of power. So if you're part of the dominant group, you may not recognize that you always have the power and that power sometimes affords you greater power. And it doesn't necessarily take into consideration other people's worldviews. So sometimes these sort of expressions such as, well, I speak on behalf of the women, or I spent lots of time in Africa, so or in one country in Africa, and therefore I can tell you something of the African voice. I'm always surprised when missionaries, having spent, let's say, 5 years, let's say 10 years, working in a Hindu community, will come to a church and explain Hinduism, but the Hindu convert that's sitting in the pew, no one ever asks that person what their view of Hinduism might be. So there's a sort of a disparity sometimes in the way that the perpetuation of power of who speaks for whom is an issue in muted group theory. And then the person that probably influenced me the most is the first time I'd seen muted group theory used in a Christian context. And that was through Linda Lee Smith-Bachman in 2018. And she talks about dominance, acceptance, and subordination. And she's a very interesting woman. She went to prison. She was had a life sentence for the death of her 2-year-old. And the death occurred because she was an abused woman in a relationship, and her partner killed her 2-year-old child, but she was given the same sentence. And while she was in prison, she became a Christ follower, and she did her master's, and she started looking at what it is to be muted in the prison. And so the Christians in the prison had their own little community. And sometimes outsiders would come in from churches to come and preach. And they could not understand how the prisoners were muted. Because they said, no, you have the same voice as us. But those bars, even when those bars are removed and the women are released from prison, the way of doing things in the prison church context is very different. And when you're on the outside, you will always be an ex-con. So Linda Smith-Bachman said, look, we need to look at this theory in terms of mission. And so that's where I sort of began my, I suppose, original contribution to knowledge in my thesis. So today we're going to look at the culture of conversion. So let's go to the slide, Bedlington's quadrilateral. So
Next one?
Yeah, no, the next one after that. Yeah. So I've used this slide before, and it's a very basic, broad brushstroke, if you like, of evangelical Christianity. So, of course, there are other aspects, other things, other nuances, and just to use these 4 words is a little bit limited, but hopefully it will just get sort of set a little bit of an idea of a context of how I use Bedlington's quadrilateral. So the evangelical experience of Christian expression can be based on these 4 cornered pieces, if you like, of crucicentrism, that we must believe in the cross, the work of the cross, conversionism, that there must be a conversion experience, that being born a Christian isn't enough, that there has to be an actual conversion experience, and also biblicism, that the Bible is central to our conversion and to our membership, really, to our belonging within evangelical Christianity, and also activism in the form of, yes, you must make a commitment to salvation, you must convert, but also part of your responsibility then as an evangelical Christian is to bring other people to that conversion experience. And so many Hindus, well, not many Hindus, but of the Hindus that have converted, and of course the Muslims and Sikhs and people from other faiths, to be inside this box of evangelical Christianity, we must accept these 4 basic cornerstones, if you like, of what it is to be a Christian. So in my thesis and in a previous presentation, what I've done is I've turned this box inside out, removed the walls so that the walls actually become the center. And so instead of being boxed in, it sort of gives instead of this sort of bounded set, we have a centered set. But when I look at Hindus that convert to Christianity, that in order to enter this box, they have to leave a lot of things aside. And although it's never actually taught that you have to leave your Hindu community, there is a sense that if the people that you're in contact with don't believe that the Bible is the word of God, don't believe that Jesus is the only way to salvation, don't believe that you need to convert from Hinduism to Christianity, and now your job is to be actively involved in evangelism, then really those people do not belong with you as a convert to Christianity. So oftentimes outside of this box is things like our family, our social activities, our interests, our networks of relationship. So during my research, I found that many British Hindus, before they come to faith, or those that don't come to faith, have really good memories of positive encounters with Christians in Britain that center around neighborly kindness and generosity. And the issue of conversion to a single identity as Christian is where the complications begin for the individual. And then these complications spread with increasing difficulty through the family, with the extended family, and throughout the community, both in Britain and back in the countries of origins. Now, prior to the establishment of Hindu temples, mandirs, the British Gujarati Hinduism that was practiced in England was a sort of a pluralism. And as a point of connection with the British community, many first-generation British Hindus, migrants, diaspora, attended churches. And throughout all my research, none of the parents of 1.5 and second-generation diaspora chose to remove their children from religious education classes at school. In fact, parents often encourage their children to attend church services. However, in due course, a number of issues were expressed in how Hindus and their practices were judged in comparison to British Christianity. So what happened was that conversion was seen to be an attack on the community, and it seemed to be a sort of a denigration of the value of its beliefs. And so it is because of this sort of thinking, I believe, that we've got the issues of religious persecution in India, where the Hindu government is forcing converts to come back to Hinduism with so much violence and so much prejudice. It's actually terrible. So anyway, Christians, through generosity and kindness, connect to a Hindu family or an individual. Then Hindus feel as a sense of honor and acceptance. They want to appreciate the connection with the Christians, and the Hindu is invited to church and enjoys occasional attendance and even regular attendance, all of which is encouraged by the Hindu family, because they're encouraged to explore other faith traditions. However, within the evangelical Christian context, the Hindu must eventually make a choice to identify either as Christian in order to belong with the dominant group and retain and strengthen the relationships at church, or continue to identify as Hindu and is therefore an outsider. So at this point, I just want to talk about some of the less visible aspects of lived experience that construct the religious identity of the Hindu in the British diaspora context. By doing so, I hope to shed light on what the British Hindu might be bringing into their church experience. The Hindu identity is assigned at birth. The self-identity is less individual than it is collective. So the Hindu identity is an integrated identity. It's the integrity of the role that's multifaceted and established in relation to the identification by others. We'll go to the next slide, please. So there is an ideological shift that occurs in conversion. Salvation, the Christian identity, is a personal, individual decision. And a term that is always used, in my opinion, is you must be born again. That's what every person that converts to evangelical Christianity, no matter from what religious tradition, even if it's within the other traditions of Christianity, Catholicism, or whatever else, you must be born again. It is not an inherited faith. And so I like to think of this ideological shift being connected to this famous statement that we all know. This ideological statement is, I think, therefore I am. So simply put, because I have the capacity and ability to think, surely I exist. So I'm a believer because I believe in my heart and confess with my mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord. So I am no longer a Hindu, I am now Christian. Let's go to the next slide. So you've probably heard this statement, Ubuntu. Has everyone heard of Ubuntu? It's kind of a popular phrase. It sort of gives people warm fuzzies nowadays. I am because we are. And it was used by Nelson Mandela, and it was used in the South African context. But in Zulu and other African languages, a person is a person through other people. Now, when I first heard, I think, therefore I am, it took me a while to figure it out, because I am who I am because that's what my mom and dad said, right? I am who I am because my parents in a Hindu home, you're the big sister. You have little sisters. You're a Gujarati. You don't eat beef. You're a Patel from this particular people. So my parents told me who I am. And my religious practice was informed not by a book, but by the role of my mother, as she did her daily. So I just want to now look at this is the final slide. The final slide, the next slide. So when a person converts to Christianity, we love to have testimonies in church. We love to bring that Muslim comment up to the front and say things like, well, we've changed the name, or don't record this, and we listen to what they've suffered as a result of the conversion and how they've been isolated from their family. And all this gives us a feeling of sort of, wow, the gospel really is real. So look at what this person has gone through. And sometimes there's a sort of an excitement of knowing the Muslim convert or Hindu convert. And when I tell people that when I took baptism, I was homeless for 2 years, even though I went to church every Sunday, they're fascinated that as an 18-year-old, actually 19-year-old, that I had that much strength. But they don't think, if you went to church every Sunday, why didn't somebody at church give you a home? And I quickly learned that when Christians say family, when they call you sister, it only means from 10 till 12 on a Sunday morning. The rest of the time, you just go God, you know. And so my whole concept of what family is had to change. But what we never hear about in church is, what did our parents go through when we converted? Those are the things that we don't want to hear. And during my research, I was in North London and I was living with this community, and I had the wonderful opportunity to be in contact with the family of Connie. And I got to ask her one day, so what happened? And I was with another convert, and the daughter who had converted, the daughter's name was Raksha, wasn't in this conversation. And the mother, whose name is, say, Rani, she burst into tears. It was 40 years since her daughter converted, and she burst into tears. And she said, she did all this in Gujarati. She said, you don't know what she did to us. You don't know how much it hurt. Don't mean emotional hurt. She said, I have one son and 4 daughters. And if you know anything about our culture, the sons are the ones who take care of the elders. And so who he marries is so important. She said, I couldn't find a bride for my son. Who would want to marry into our family when our oldest child, and she goes, Nikri Gaiti. She didn't even have a word for conversion. Nikri Gaiti means when she left, when she was extracted, and when she was disposed of. So I don't know if any of you have seen Pride and Prejudice. You know the story of Pride and Prejudice, and the mother is desperately looking for rich men for her daughters to marry because their livelihood was dependent on a man to take care of them. And the second from the youngest daughter, Kitty, runs away with a soldier and spends the night away from home. We don't even know in the beginning of the scene that she's actually with him or what's taken place. But for sure, the family's reputation was destroyed Because to spend the night as a single woman away from your parents could only mean sex was involved. And that's exactly what it was like for the Hindu converts. Because we were encouraged to not be in any place that there were idols, which means we couldn't stay in our own home. When we left, the Christians only gave us a home for one night. We were literally homeless. The number of Gujarati people, there's 300 Gujarati converts in Britain. I've spoken to 200 of them. And the number of converts that have told me about suicide attempts, self-harm, and being homeless. But they can't share this in church because in church, we want the success story. This woman, she's in her 80s now. She's not a Christian yet. No, the daughter is a Christian. But she can't reconcile the fact that her daughter made this personal choice. I am, it's what I want that counts. Instead of thinking, I am because of who people think I am and where I belong. A person being a person through other people, it's not understood in evangelical Christianity. We understand it on a Sunday morning, but we don't understand it beyond religious speak often. And that to me poses a difficulty in how we do conversion and how we do discipleship and how we do relationship. Because basically we not only discard or ignore where that person came from, convert came from, but we discard the people they came from. Now, in Rani's story, she said they had a business and they needed money. Now, back in the 70s and 80s, banks didn't give loans to Indian people as readily as they do now. And so if you wanted to buy a house or get a mortgage, 60s, 70s, and even part of the 80s, you had to get it from other people, other family members, other relatives. And the reason they would give you money is, let's say, for example, Damon. If I said to Damon, Damon, I need to buy a house, I can't get a mortgage. Can you loan me £5,000? Damon would look and say, oh my goodness, Usha's got 3 children. And one day they're going to grow up and they're going to be educated, they're going to do well. And I want to contribute to that because eventually they will then have influence. They will be part of my relation. If you can't control your own daughter, how much of a wise investment would it be to give her? So their business failed and they literally had to live and be anonymous. Another story was of a man, and this was in Leicester. And his brother and his sister became Christian. And I said, well, what's it like for you? He goes, well, I don't do Raksha Bandhan anymore. Raksha Bandhan is a special festival, it's around Easter time, where a brother and a sister recognize the value of each other. And from childhood, it's kind of like, when you do Santa Claus, Father Christmas to your children, they don't understand, but you still get a Christmas stocking for a baby, right? Even if it's a newborn baby. So that the sister ties a cord onto the brother's. And by tying the cord, it's a promise to say that I will always pray for you, and I will always pray for your well-being. And the brother responds by giving her cash, or clothes, or jewelry. And what he's saying is that I know that this isn't your permanent home because one day you'll get married and you'll leave and go to your husband's home. But as long as I'm living, I will always make sure that you're taken care of. Even when our parents die, if your brother treats you badly, I'm with you. And he said, even if parents die, husband die or is bad, the brother is always taken care of. So now no more because they're Christian. So he can't love his sister and promise to take care of her because she does not want to celebrate Raksha Bandhan. So by unmuting the lives of the unconverted and the converted, it's not about victim and perpetrator. It's about working in the blurry spaces to use muted group theory to unmute actions and behaviors that actually could have redemptive value. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, that's it. Thank you, Usha. Let me stop share. And if you have any comments or questions for Usha, at the bottom of the screen, for those of you who have joined online, you can click the reaction buttons, and then it will say raise hand. And if I see your raised hand, I will call on you. And in terms of the room, I will look around and anyone who would like to comment or to ask Usha a question, please note by raising your hand. So, do I have a hand?
Something to silence.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Alfred. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Usha. Thank you so much again. I managed to get here. Question. We are affected in a similar way in post-modern, post-Christian, post-church society. And we've been finding recently that group conversion is better. And this, let me explain, than individualizing in conversion, so that we have something called a welcome group, and people start coming and coming and coming. And then, they have all the questions. And then we have a group conversion night, right? Where they all sort of come to the Lord and the Lordship of Christ. And then that means, of course, that they're born in a community. And that community continues after, the sort of conversion. And I think, therefore, I think in this group, and therefore we are, and I am part of the group, sort of that becomes the way in which a new Christian is validated here. We're finding that very useful. And I just wonder, a comment, whether you care to comment on this, because at our Bible college, All Nations, we were very much encouraged to work this way with groupings like Hindu cultures, Muslim cultures. Find a large grouping before you speak about conversion. Can you comment on that?
Thanks, Al. I appreciate the question. I think probably more and more we're moving towards this idea of speaking less to an individual and more to a group. And I think that's a good thing. And it's necessary, I believe, but also with the people that don't join the group and move forward, what is our relationship with the people that don't move forward? Do we discard them, ignore them, separate them from those that do believe? I mean, that's what I would ask, is that how are we maintaining relationship? We've heard of sort of colonial exploitation in terms of resources in majority world countries. But we have to think about that in terms of people's relationships and ideologies as well. Is where are we? What are we doing? Are we just going in and doing sort of continued raping and pillaging? Or are we saying, actually, let's do some thinking alongside? And the question is that there's no shortcuts to salvation, but there are individual journeys, and that the binary of belonging and not belonging to a group is somewhere where we've actually got to be more creative in how we listen.
Super. Yeah, thanks. That's so true. And just to say that we're finding that actually spreads out to the non-committed people, because they bring their friends, their families, and it's all part of a community that's widening all the time. Thanks for that.
We have a question from Siddhi. Go ahead, Siddhi.
Thanks, Didi, for your
very encouraging. So I'm just thinking about, the culture shape our identity. And also there are the cultural, superiority, Mike, I just wonder, what is the identity in Christ means in cultural and religious conflict and converging scenario?
I like that. I grapple with this identity in Christ thing all the time. Because when we're in a Christian place and we're sitting here, well, my identity is in Christ. So we all accept, Damon looks different from you and from me. Sorry. But do you know something? If Joyce walked into a white church, they'd think she's a Muslim. So she can think I'm a Christian all she likes, but if the people around her see her as a Muslim, they're going to treat her differently. Right? So being able to use a term like my identity is in Christ, it's about how you're identifying other people. Right? So my identity in Christ should therefore lead me to accept Joyce as a person made in the image of God. But chances are, just because she's got that fabric around her head, identifies her as something else.
So, let me, I just wonder, what is more, do we have a more practice or value, in that context? How do we live in the community or in the society, culture? So,
if you're like a Hindu, or if you're a convert living in India, is that what you mean? Like something like that?
Yeah, right.
Well, it seems to me, and I haven't lived in India, so you'll have to forgive me. When I went to Gujarat, I met these through various contacts. I was taken to this Christian community, and they were they were the people who make the streets, their road closers. And I went to their house, and it was a dome floor house, and they looked at me and they wondered if I was really a Christian. And they cooked chicken and they served it to me to see if I would eat it. Because they needed to know, is she really a Christian or is she just pretending to be? Right? And so I would like to think that we have other ways of identifying Christ-likeness. For example, I think I've used this example before. If you go to the Gurudwaras here, the Sikh temples, even the one here in Oxford, they will give free food to anybody at any time. They will. You just go. They even say, we had that faith walk last year, come every Sunday, bring your whole church, come. Now, to me, that's a Christ-like identity in generosity. Are they Christians? No. But they're displaying something that is Christ-like. Right? So I can choose to connect with that Christ-like aspect by visiting the mandir. My husband goes to the mosque regularly, especially during Ramadan, and he engages with people there. And if I go to this Gurudwara and have lunch every Sunday, it's not going to take away my salvation, but it'll give me the opportunity to let them see something of the Christ-likeness that's in me. So there's got to be places of crossover. So in a sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it says, as I said, I haven't lived in India. The separation of now you've joined the Christian community, you had to leave the Hindu community in order to join the Christian community, has just resulted in more separation, right? You've got one more that may be going to heaven, but you've got 10 more people that are angry with Christianity. So where are the blurry spaces that we can say who I am in Christ is so real? And it's the same power that raised Christ from the dead. For goodness sake, I'm not going to lose my salvation by hanging out with Sikhs, right? So at what point can we unmute the unconverted's voice in a way that we as Christians can listen? Because we know, right? We know who we are in Christ. This is cool.
Usha, just to come back on your last point, at what point can we unmute the subordinate group? So you said that, and I want to know how the dominant group can unmute the subordinate.
It's a good question. Sometimes I wear a sari. I love wearing saris. One is because it's very easy to wear and easy to look after, and two is because I'm really bad at choosing English clothes, so I have to wear the same thing all the time. But one of the things is to accept the cultural things that we bring in. Like, you know that there's colour runs everywhere now. Have you heard of the colour run? Do you know what the colour run is? Okay, it's like you get runners do it. They run, they go for a run, like a 5K run. And on this particular race, they throw colours at them. That's actually from the Holi festival from India, right? So when a convert comes in, we want to learn more about them than we actually need to teach them. They're going to get discipleship. They're going to get that opportunity to learn more about you. But if we lose what they came from because they're taught to shun it, right? We lose the capacity to unmute. We lose the capacity to connect with who they came from. So, like, for example, I gave the example, the guy, Rakshabandhan, the brother who no longer can separate this really important part of the Hindu calendar, the cultural calendar. Because if you ask any Hindu what's the background, they don't know. They only know, it's like, you know, when you ask a person in the West who's never been to church, all they might know of Christmas is Father Christmas, right? So they know nothing about any religious background of Rakshabandhan, but they still do it. Why don't we ask them what things are important? What do you miss? What do you miss from being a Sikh? What do you miss from being a Muslim? I asked a guy that a couple of weeks ago. I said, what do you miss about being Muslim? He said, I miss at the mosque where all the children would hang out, we would all eat together and we'd all play together. Because he did that as a child. We don't have anything like that being an adult, you know, just the hanging out and sitting, not having an agenda. We try it after church, we have a quick coffee. We don't have anything that means the same thing. The Sikhs having dinner every Sunday. If you did that in a church, they'd go, oh, people will take advantage of us. And so I think part of that is listening and encouraging them. Not just on one time a year where you bring, oh, we're going to have International Day, so bring your samples. Let's go beyond that. Or let's invite the Africans to do a song. Let's go beyond that.
Sure, I think this framework of muting that you've been working within is very interesting. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about all the recent experience we've had of learning how Zoom or Google Meet or whatever works. And I was just thinking about muting. I mean, that there are different ways in which people can be muted or unmuted. They can be muted by somebody who has power because they are the owner of the account and they can shut people down or open it up. You can invite people to unmute themselves, or you can unmute them without asking their permission to unmute them. And so I think all of those are just things I'm playing around with in my mind in relation to the conversion process that you're talking about. But the bit that I was thinking about at the end, as in my little thought process, which I welcome your comment on, is that the most frustrating experience of muting on Zoom is when Zoom mutes you. Because something's gone wrong, the technology shuts you down, which is a sort of structural or systemic muting. And I just wondered whether you have any thoughts on, in the context you're talking about, how we deal with structural or systemic muting.
That's really good. I've been involved in mission 35 years with the same agency. And I've lived in the Middle East, I'm an Arabic speaker. I notice that when Western missionaries come, if a Western missionary comes, they're given a platform to speak, and oftentimes they will use metaphors, stories, especially Americans, on big sport, basketball, football. In fact, if you go to the US, footballers, if your child is involved in football, it's quite a high status, and it says something about their ability to do things like teamwork or work under good leadership or persevere. And we're very good at using these sort of analogies. I'm going to read you a different analogy. And even as far as like, had this analogy been used before I started my PhD, I might have pushed away from it, but I want you to listen to the story and see if we could use this analogy. Because we use basketball, baseball, fishing stories. Can we use this one? The ancient king Trishanku was known for his exemplary service to the eternal God and to people. He believed that he should be allowed to go to heaven in his mortal body. His guru admonished him and sent him away for making so foolish a request. Trishanku proceeded to seek out the sons of his guru, who were appalled by Trishanku's request. They cursed him and transformed his honorable status as king to an outcast and gravedigger, thus confined to wandering through the places of cremations and burials. One day, another guru saw Trishanku, who recognized the king as trapped in the lowly estate. He listened to Trishanku's plight and offered to grant the request. The guru wanted to prove his powers to all and asked Trishanku to invite an audience that included the previous guru and his sons, as well as other dignitaries. Using all the highest rituals, the guru was unable to get Trishanku to heaven. After much effort and desperation, the guru was still unsuccessful. Those around him jeered at his failure. The guru used fiercer incantations and summoned even greater powers until Trishanku's body began to rise towards heaven. As he approached heaven, the gatekeepers therein began to protest that Trishanku could not possibly enter heaven in his mortal body and vehemently threw his body back toward earth. Having been on the journey to heaven, if Trishanku returned to earth, he would surely die. Upon hearing Trishanku's cries for help, the guru begged an audience with the gatekeepers of heaven, while Trishanku was left suspended between heaven and earth. The guru pleaded for a compromise. The gatekeepers of heaven decided to allow the guru to create a replica of heaven, where Trishanku could remain, but on condition that he would remain suspended upside down for eternity. Now, a mythological story, but one that a lot of converts would be able to relate to. But it's easier for a dominant voice to use sports metaphors. But these might work.
And then we'll go with Daniel.
Okay, so when I heard that story, I found it very difficult because I don't have the insights into the meanings of the different aspects of the story. Which brings me back to the fact that the dominant group choose the form of communication, terminology, social norms, the way you listen to it. The subordinate group, you said, learn then to communicate amongst themselves using the way of communication that the dominant group have said is the way we communicate. And that actually, you then went on to say that there is something required about translation to even begin to hear the muted voice. And I think your example that you just gave there, for me, was very powerful because I couldn't connect with a lot of that because it's not my life experience. And it was a very timely reminder that actually a lot of what we say to people from other faiths maybe isn't part of their life experience. So there is a breakdown in communication. So I think linked to this, and forgive me if I'm finding a long way round of saying it, is, do you think there's something to do with religious translation that is necessary in these spaces where you're trying to understand a different worldview?
I don't know if it's just religious translation. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, if you went to areas like Leicester, you might see decorations, Christmas decorations in October, or celebrating Diwali. I don't think that's weird. Why would they have Christmas decorations? But now you can find Diwali stuff everywhere all the time. So a lot of it comes from exposure, right? And it's hard for the dominant group. If you want to keep dominance, it's really hard if you're stuck within a structure. But if you can, as followers of Christ, if we can believe that this central part of who Jesus is will always remain central, right? We're more likely to flex our boundaries and be comfortable with unfamiliar stories, because the more you connect as a dominant group with unfamiliar stories, the more familiar they will become, and they will broaden. It might dilute your dominance, but it'll broaden your influence.
Daniel Button, will you unmute and ask your comment?
Yeah, well, thank you, Usha. It's great to see you again, and thank you for a very fascinating presentation. I just want to take you back to earlier in your conversation, and I was curious that you quite frequently contrasted, you know, the very strong group, cultural, relational dynamic with evangelical Christianity. And of course, everyone would agree that, you know, Western post-Enlightenment evangelical Christianity has a very dominant individualism, but most of us would associate that with Western cultural and post-Enlightenment values rather than with Christianity per se. And yet, I'm just wondering, you seem to maybe indicate that you see an inherent kind of individual aspect to Christianity. You brought out the verse, you know, but you must be born again, or perhaps being adopted into Christ is almost like moving out from your previous family. Do you see that as a problem that is inherent within Christianity, or is it, I mean, within biblical Christianity, or is it something that's really a cultural issue?
Really is a cultural issue, and I think it comes from a template of what evangelical Christianity, or how it has been used, especially in terms of mission and conversion. I mean, anyone that's spent any time in mission work, especially working amongst Muslims, that you could probably within 5 minutes do a Google search and find at least a dozen templates of how to reach Muslims. And each of them will claim to be the best way. And so we've got these sort of very fixed ideas of what this looks like and how it should look in order for us to place someone in a particular position. Strange echo there, Daniel.
I don't know what's coming from Daniel.
Anyway, does that help? I mean, I'm very happy for you to give another comment on that, Daniel. I mean, does that answer the question or address it in any way, or am I just like?
Yeah, no, I think you've addressed it in saying that it's primarily cultural, but it does seem to be, it does seem to have worked its way into a lot of cultural dynamics where there would, you would think, be a very strong group relational dynamic, even with a new, you know, even with Christianity coming in as something new. And I don't know, you know, how, I mean, I'm just speculating here, but it's very easy to pin that on missionaries, and rightfully so. But But is there anything more to it, do you think? Is there something about the nature of Christianity that draws one out from the context in which they're, that family dynamic that they're very much interwoven into, and sort of almost forces a person to make a separation?
The desire for belonging is great. And I think converts want to belong. And also, although we would largely disagree, Western culture is still the prevalent culture of the world, as the preferred, the sort of the better culture. Even though we wouldn't say it out loud, we still act on that. You know, I mean, if you look at books and who reviews books, you know, we kind of tend to like the Western voice to affirm who we are. Even majority world people, we all do. And so there's a tendency for us to, the dominant voice of culture also pulls us in that direction. I have immense white privilege. I speak English. I've got a British passport. So that aspect of it will always, it's not just what's said in church, it's what's going on out there as well, right?
Usha, thank you. So a lot of what we're, if I understand it, the majority, not the majority, the dominant group are muting others. In Mark's Zoom illustration, also you talked about being shut down by the system or by those who control, who've got the power. But surely our most common experience of Zoom is when we want to speak and somebody says, "You're muted," and we can unmute ourselves. Is that at all relevant? Or is that taking, are there times when we're muted but we can unmute ourselves, and how do we learn how to unmute ourselves? Was that?
I think you can unmute through relationship. And I've explained this probably, I don't know how many times. I would say that Damon was probably, for me, the person that unmuted me. But when I sat in my RIS and sat right where you're sitting, and the rest of the students were all men, and I would see Rachel, and I was convinced Rachel was coming in to tell me that she'd sent me the wrong letter and I shouldn't go on a PhD program. And I remember listening to everyone talking about their wonderful work and their studies, and I'm like, oh, I've been a missionary, that's all I've done. I didn't publish anything, and I'm not famous, and I don't have a title or anything. And then OneSook as well. The different faculty members, when they came in, they had certain ways that helped me to unmute, and they encouraged, and you're, as faculty members, you know how to do this. You know how to walk into the room full of new students, and you can tell the ones who are feeling really inadequate and the ones who've always had the voice to lead, and they come in very confident, and what it takes to bring that place of muting and unmuting in order to get to the place that we need to go. So when I teach, there's a couple of African students that I teach as part of at Waverley Abbey College, and they tell me that when we walk into a room, actually they're Jamaican, when we walk into a room, we've just given up because we know people aren't going to greet us, so we just sit there because it's just not worth it. It's just too emotionally draining. Just been through it enough, and then the other people, yeah, but that's your fault. And it's sort of, how many times can people be rejected before they just give up and they just don't want to be hurt anymore?
Dave Burnett, go ahead and unmute and make your comment or question.
Well, thank you, Urshi. I've been thinking about my first time in India back in 1971. I arrived, and as a new sort of being missionary, was encouraged to go along to the Evangelical Methodist Church there in Madras, Chennai today. And I went in there, and it was just like an English church. It had English songs there, but everyone was Indian. And as I talked to them, I realized that they'd all been extracted, sometimes but more by choice than others, and had taken off this sort of pseudo Anglo-Indian lifestyle there. It's not what I expected when I went to India. And so my wife and I, we went along to Jehovah Shammah, one of the Boxing assemblies, where we sat on the floor, men on the right, women on the left, and remember our little daughter coming across, to us, and we would have meals, together, with eat with our hand. And it was still a very much a biblical service in all that went on. And here I saw something that was being expressed in a very Tamil Christian way. And the following year, a man called Donald McGavran came. And if you've read any of his books, and he's talking about extraction evangelism. So, this is what kept on coming to my mind. And I think, there's two sides, I think, comes to this. The dominant one, especially in this country, are those who are the Christians in the church, and we need to give them, help to understand the cultural differences. I've been helping with the Hong Kong migrants, and one dear lady yesterday at church said, look, if I invite them along and give them, roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, they will like that, won't they? And so we had a conversation. So there's that side. We need to be, helping people understand, of that, the dominant one, to understand, the difference in culture and what is meaning. But also, and this is where I accept sort of your point, we need to be seeing help to people on that journey, that it isn't sort of, you pray and it's, you've made that line, but see it as a pathway to follow Jesus. And, I like what many writers have been talking about recently, about sort of following Jesus. And, I'm a Jesus follower, so it's not, I'm a Christian. And so it isn't you're crossing a social barrier, but you're progressing somewhere. And I've known Indian Hindu converts, not Gujarati, but and they've expressed some of this, and sort of to their family, and their family have been, upset because the biggest problem has sort of been saying, I won't go to the guru, the family guru, making the separation, from that. But for us, not expecting them to pull right away, to be different. And so I think there's, two sides that we need to be doing and understanding. I think a lot of Christians have understood this in different ways, maybe using different terms than muted group theory, but to try to see this progression onwards. And sometimes as Westerners, I think we've condemned things. I remember once in Benares, going to the Catholic Church there. And I was shocked, to see all around the walls of the church there are pictures of the life of Christ in Indian style, all the way around. It tells the story. I thought, well, this is almost like a Buddhist temple with the pictures around. Then when it came to communion, anyone could join. And so some of the Hindus who were just passing by lined up and all went and sort of were, prayed for. And I found in my own reaction, well, you can't, be offering to them. And I thought, why? Because maybe the communion does have got something quite significant here. This is not just words that I'm putting into their mind, but this is them coming to Christ, and they're coming to receive, and they'll understand. So, well, I thought it's not a question, but this is what you did. You took me back into the, the 70s and some of the things there. And I think we've got to be learning this. It is important. And so if you can express these ideas in muted group theory, fine. I'm very happy to see that go forward.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think one of the things about this whole idea of dominant and subordinate is, and I think I've said it before, is that it's not, look, all of us are going to be in a position at some point where we feel dominant or subordinate, there's that. But also in the life, in Christian life, in going from, convert, we tend to look at it as a linear progression. Like, oh, look at Usha, she's become a Christian, now she's baptized, now she's a minister, now she's doing this, now she's a missionary. And we have to think that this value that we give is created by us. Okay? It's not. So, for example, there's a Gujarati camp coming up in August. It's been going on for 51 years, and it's held in Leicester. And we really need some help, because some of the people have been serving there for years and they're getting on 50 years. But if I invite a group of, say, young missionaries, either from UK or from the US, and 5 students come, in their teens, 20s, whatever, because they're a white face, there is an expectancy for them to have the podium, and there is expectancy amongst the Indians. Like, for example, my husband is coming this year for the first time because he hasn't been in Britain in August in other years. And immediately he was at a planning meeting, and they're like, oh, well, Matt's got to speak. Well, why? Why does he have to speak? He's a white American. Yeah, he knows my culture, but you didn't invite me to speak when I first came, but because a white manager. So this idea of dominance and subordination is something that we have to constantly look at our own way and questioning in ourselves about how we put people in a sense of hierarchy, and so it's not, for example, if I'm amongst Indian Christians, oh, she's got a PhD, she must be able to speak on everything now. Actually, no, I can't. And if there's anything that you learn when you're doing your PhD is that there's a lot more to learn than you've actually learned, and you feel dumber than you've ever felt in your whole life, because there's so much knowledge out there. So this dominant subordinate thing, it's not a linear thing. And just because we learn about it once doesn't mean that we won't have blind spots in the future. So thank you. Anyway,
Thank you.
So yeah, there's a couple. Oasis Network was waiting. Is he there?
have we lost Oasis?
Maybe you've left.
I've been trying to work this out. Thanks, Usha. That was a really very thoughtful piece you've given us. And I think Christianity suffers by being propagated by a dominant culture.
Yeah.
So wherever they go, they're not listeners. And I think just looking at the Christian story, it's from a supportive group. It was never meant to be a dominant culture. Christianity was propagated by those who came to offer both provision, but not so much transformation. Certainly, I'm thinking of the African story.
Yes, sure.
So that completely makes it more commercial. So we come to what you talk about. Have you got a PhD? Have you got this? So many people converted, and parents allowed them to convert because it will progress them.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with transformational character. And you have to, there's so much at play in what you said. I mean, I think the potential for your thesis is over there because there's so much at play in how people receive, how they perceive themselves in the face of a dominant, powerful Christianity in itself being carried by powerful people. I mean, it's a double whammy.
I think that's a really good comment. And I think this is one of the reasons I believe in the West, it's harder to communicate the gospel. You've got white people who will go and be missionaries in Africa or Asia or Latin America, but won't be able to talk to their neighbor about Jesus. It's because we have this idea that Christianity is there to bring somebody who's less than us up a little bit. But how are we going to communicate the gospel to somebody who doesn't need your money, your education, your wealth, your medicine, or anything else? Is there a truth that I can communicate to you without looking down on you, without being dominant?
I think that's the problem. The truth actually is that by going down, you come up. And that's not what Christianity teaches in the dominant culture. I mean, it's a mixture of ideas. You know, it's powerful and yet it's humble. I mean, how do you convey that? You know, and I think there's a lot to do with how you live it. In the end, that might be the answer. That whatever you are, let's see how you live. And that's what will attract people. Because what you say is a different matter. You've learned a lot. You know, so you say it in a language. I think I agree with Anne. I couldn't relate to that analogy you gave. Because contextually, I couldn't go anywhere near there. I can relate to the stories in the Bible sometimes, the shepherd, the sower, you know, those are quite basic. And for that, we have to appreciate the wisdom of the Bible. But in a sense, a dominant group, it can be quite damaging. You know, in our place, most families don't care if they are people. In fact, we have a minority Muslim group in Ghana. And the Muslims, of course, maybe not just because they are subordinate, they just will not abide conversion. Whereas the dominant group don't mind conversion. Many families, Christian families, have a Muslim converts who are treated normally.
Yeah.
Because they're not a threat. Yes. I mean, you can live there because you haven't lost your strictness.
Yeah.
You know, so we don't mind whatever religion you pick up, because it was never transformational anyway to start with.
Right.
It's just a way of getting on
So
in
it's
society.
the difference between transformational and provisional.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Thank
I
you.
think it's worth seeing what the missionaries bring. They came with a lot. You know, came with a lot. You pick what you need.
Thank you.
Thank you, Usha, for that presentation, which for me it's new, revealing at the same time. Coming from a Latino Hispanic context, evangelical Pentecostal, I don't know if in the middle of your research or in the process of your research, the categories that we usually communicate in preaching the gospel, which is I'm saying you're not, sin versus not sinning, those concepts are so aggressive, coming from a dominant that puts the other side in a very in a less competitive, if I should say that word. So did you encounter that part of the research, the fact that the categories that we use or the phrases that come from the gospel, meaning we're saved but you're not, therefore at some, or sin, you're sinning, you're but we're not, so I don't know if that came across in your.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I had to do it within myself first because I'm a convert. And I remember when I first came to faith and I would go to my parents and tell them they were going to hell because I was trying to get them saved. Right. And despite the massive obstacle that I was to my parents for decades, if there's anything that kept my parents away from Christianity, it was me. They eventually came to faith miraculously, and they lived here 50 years. And when they went back to India, they through miraculous circumstances. And I think the biggest one was that I wasn't there. They actually came to faith. And so, yes, the part of the problem is that, and it's in Stuart Hall, the position and representation, and in, I think it was standpoint theory that Mark Orb talks about, where we stand and where we think we speak from needs to constantly be reviewed. And we have got away from, and perhaps too much, I don't know, where we don't even in church talk about sin and not sin, right? So there could be, I hate to use this example, but I could be in the US and there could be an obese woman, right, who tells me off because I've got a dot on my head. telling me that that's evil, and I'm thinking, have you not heard of gluttony, sister? You know what I mean? Say that out loud. Right?
That's what Spurgeon said, D.L. Moody, in the stomach with his pipe.
What a privilege that to hear, and I'm wearing a sari that shows less than an inch of my back. You got an issue with that? I can see your belly button, mate. So the thing about this is that, and I'm not making light of it. The reason I make light of it is to sort of, in a sense, say that this theory sounds very rigid. And I think Tim Keane, I listened to a lecture the other day, it sounds domineering. I think that's the term that he used. But in actual fact, when you put it into practice, when you look at different aspects of life, it makes you think a little bit different. And surely part of our remit as followers of Jesus is representing as his representatives on earth, along with all creation, is to sort of look at ourselves and to look at the other some way that's a little bit different, that gives a different perspective, that helps us look at the blurry spaces more than the black and white. Space between black and white might be that rather than
Yeah, one of the things that I would notice is I think we also need to learn from other cultures and other contexts. One of the things that's very interesting in the Singapore framework is that conversion has the same kind of destabilizing effect because in Chinese culture, everything is related. So even your name within a Chinese family is related to another. So I'm little brother, I'm big brother, or I'm first son, second son, third son. And one of the things that when Christianity really began to rise in the culture, it created a lot of disturbance in families. But one of the things that I found fascinating on a couple levels, one is that within the Singapore churches, they work at networking with the whole family. So one of the things within an extended Chinese family in Singapore is you have the dialect speaking grandparents who will be much more comfortable within a dialect group. Then you have the Chinese speaking parents who will want to go to a Chinese service, the children who are English speaking and they want to go to an English service. Then you got the grandchildren running around all over the place, but they all want to be together for the family lunch. So one of the things you'll do is you'll see in Chinese churches, they'll have services for each so that the people can come and then come together. The other thing that was really significant in terms of distancing from the white missionaries was some interesting aspects of evangelicalism. One is the interpretation of scripture. Once you got to the point of translating the gospel into Chinese, the Chinese would have the advantage. And so they become the primary persons who then translate the text and the text to the people. And that's one thing that Laman Sane points out in his translating the message. And so very quickly it moves from the missionary to those who have the power of speech. One of the interesting things in terms of, and I've written on this actually, we were writing about how did Chinese Christianity brought by the missionaries become Christianity that was indigenous in China. Another one though actually was testimony, but testimony in a different way. It was in the big movements by John Sung. When people would want to become a Christian, they would say, well, tell your story. And one of the things I point out is that's a Chinese story. That's a story that comes out of their flow and the sickness of their grandmother and that they prayed for, that kind of thing. And they even use those stories to critique the missionaries, right? But the missionaries don't have this power anymore, but God has given it to us and that sort of thing. The last thing was fascinating in terms of within Chinese circles at that time, and I'm kind of disappointed now in this regard, is that it was in hymn writing that you got, and even today within the Chinese church, there's been great hymn writers in the house churches that are writing hymns, and there's this one woman who is just absolutely the engine of hymn writing and sung across the world, but those are indigenous Chinese hymns with Chinese thoughts and ideas. One of the sadnesses is when I see the Western songs from Southern California that now seem to be everywhere. You know, and you have the little quartet and the soloist kind of thinking. And we get back to that kind of unmuting where people are writing and creating their music that captures us. The mesos, Marina's up there. That's one thing I love about meso worship. For the whole half hour up before you start the worship, just sing songs to the meso beat. And they write their own tunes and their own lyrics, and it is amazing. And then they do spirit dancing. So they all jump up and then they go in circles and spirit dance. And so they're very Presbyterian at one point. Right at 11 o'clock, they all sit down and that's
Thanks. The thing is, there are these things, and I think there is even in the churches here in Britain, I think there is room. The Gujarati camp that I was telling you about, it's in August, and since I've been going, I mean, even before then, they're doing more the call and repeat, which I've done when I've led worship here. We've done the call and repeat type singing, and you know, if any of you are interested in kind of coming and helping out with that, it would be interesting to see how these kind of things could be done elsewhere, not as a template, but just as an experiment in watching these, because until I started my research, I had never been with any other Gujarati Christians, any other converts. So my research time filled a massive cavernous gap in my life. And unmuted me like people were like, Usha, really, were you ever muted? But it did a massive thing for me. And then when I get to be with these Gujarati people, and I get to spend the weekend eating rice with my hands, if I want to, and singing in half Gujarati and half English, because so many of us are married to Westerners as well, is what this looks like when it's all kind of together and what comes out of it. What I'd like to start doing with the younger generation is memorizing scripture in our mother tongue.
Yeah.
Because the first time I heard the Lord's Prayer in my own language, I was in my 50s. Yeah. And what the meaning of hearing the word Bapuji, which is what I call my dad, when we said father, and rotli instead of bread, not roti, which is a Hindi word, but rotli, which is the Gujarati word, it had a massive impact on me. So in unmuting those little things, I think it's, yeah, but anyway, thank you.
Wow.
Well, good. Well, thank you, Usha, for another great session. And we've got more of the Unmuted series coming. Who's next week?
Next week, we should have Connie Duarte, who is the General Secretary, one of the two General Secretaries of the European Evangelical Alliance. Her colleague Jan is with us today. So, and Connie was the one that really helped me get this started when I first approached the idea of muted group theory during the Lausanne 2021 online conference. So she will be speaking. We will also there will be a talk on unmuting colorism. So the lighter you are, the more value you have, and what that unmuting colorism. We also have one on church conflict and how resolving the actual progressive way to forgiveness. And if anyone's been a Christian for any amount of time, you've been hurt. How do we resolve these sort of things? So how do we unmute conflict? So there's lots more interesting talks to come.
Good. Well, with that, we bid you adieu and look forward to seeing you next week. Hey, Rosemary, good to see you. So with that,
Thanks, Usha.
Thanks so much.
Be in touch soon, eh?
Yes, indeed. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.